Hello, my name is John Tuman. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And today I'm presenting on a paper that examines foreign direct investment at the subnational level in the Mexican automotive parts sector in the period of 2004 to 2018 with a focus on union organization. This paper is a collaborative project and co-authored with Hafthor Erlingsson, a lecturer in political science at the University of Texas, Rio Grande, and also a PhD graduate from UNLV. I've been working on the Mexican automotive industry since the early 1990s. Most of my prior work has focused on the finished vehicle sector and labor, and specifically union and worker responses to economic restructuring and regional integration in the industry. This project brings together my prior work on the auto industry in Mexico with more recent work that I've done on foreign direct investment, both at the subnational level in Mexico, but also in Latin America more generally. If you look at the Mexican automotive parts sector, it quickly becomes clear that it has an enormous economic impact both in Mexico but also in North America. So the Mexican automotive parts sector is the fifth largest global producer. It's highly integrated with the US market. So on average, the vast majority of all of the automotive parts that are exported from Mexico end up in the US market. The sector makes an important contribution to Mexico's manufacturing gross domestic product and overall employment, and it accounts for a highly significant share of foreign direct investment that flows into Mexico at the subnational level. Beyond the economic significance of the auto industry in Mexico, it's important to note that the automotive parts sector and the auto industry in Mexico more generally were a highly salient topic in the USMCA negotiations. A particularly contentious issue was the allegation involving the nexus between weak labor conditions enabled by so-called protection contracts offered by affiliates of the Confederation of Mexican Workers and foreign direct investment. This led to special labor rights that were incorporated into an annex of the USMCA agreement that were focused on Mexico that required, among other things, Mexico to introduce amendments to its federal labor law to ensure several commitments, including union democracy. And this has led in Mexico to the so-called legitimation process, which is still underway, in which the government is obliged to make sure that workers are voting for their collective bargaining agreements in elections which are free and fair and involve a secret ballot. There were other wage rules that, of course, were introduced under the USMCA for the auto industry, and the reference point, again, for those wage rules were concerns about low wages and how weak labor conditions were associated with weak wage growth in Mexico. In this paper, the main question that we explore is whether or not the subnational pattern of foreign direct investment in the automotive parts sector in Mexico was influenced by unionization, and if so, by different types of unionization. We look at foreign direct investment across all of Mexico's 31 states and Mexico City and the federal district for the period of 2004 to 2018, and we cover all subsectors of automotive parts. The paper and study also controls for other standard influences on foreign direct investment in the automotive parts sector. And we view the paper as basically extending and complementing the prior qualitative literature which is developed on the sector. Many excellent studies have been done that have focused on labor relations, and although foreign direct investment has often not been the principal focus of those papers, many of the studies about labor relations have also made claims about how weak labor standards in the sector have induced foreign direct investment. But unfortunately, the prior qualitative literature has not examined that question systematically. And so we see the study as essentially providing further observational data and evidence to bolster the prior qualitative literature. The theoretical approach that informs our study is basically derived from political economy, with also some engagement in the literature of comparative institutionalism. Our starting point is the recognition that investments in land and machinery represent sunk costs, and an early exit from the Mexican market is potentially very costly for firms. And given that, to make foreign direct investment profitable over the investment cycle, firms are driven to minimize costs and to boost worker productivity. We also recognize that the machinery and materials involved in producing a range of different automotive parts is very specific, and so we could think of this in terms of asset specificity and have few alternative uses. In that context, then, firms develop very specific and strong interests related to their investment and also different types of public policies. Further, when we look at automotive parts production, our starting point is the recognition that production is labor intensive, and a result of that is that firms are particularly sensitive to labor costs when they make decisions about foreign direct investment in Mexico and in other markets. So if you look, for example, at the types of automotive parts which are produced widely in Mexico, if you're talking about wire harnesses, for example, ignition sets, seats or parts of seats, steering column assemblies, etc., all of those have a labor use profile that involves very labor intensive production. Wire harnesses, for a variety of reasons, are difficult. The production of wire harnesses is difficult to automate. And that means that if you're involved in producing wire harnesses, at least in this point in time, you're going to be looking at a heavy input of manual labor. And although there have been recent discussions around digitalization in Mexico, this occurred largely outside of the time frame of our study, and the preliminary evidence suggests, in any case, that digitalization thus far has been uneven in its diffusion and confined mainly to Tier 1 suppliers. To summarize the argument thus far, given the labor-intensive nature of production across many different segments of the automotive parts industry in Mexico, firms are particularly sensitive to labor costs. The greater the sensitivity to labor costs, then, the stronger the incentive of firms to appraise the likelihood of unionization. Most of the time, sensitivity to labor costs would lead firms to avoid unions. That is to say, they would look to invest in states and areas within those states in Mexico that reduce the likelihood of unionization, given the fact that unions would tend to induce an upward pressure on contract wages. In the Mexican context, however, it's important to understand that union avoidance was often not practical in many segments of the auto industry. So the auto industry is a strategic sector in Mexico. It's highly visible. It's also highly dependent on foreign capital. There are certainly some Mexican firms associated with conglomerates that participate and produce in the automotive parts sector, but overwhelmingly in both the finished vehicles sector and in automotive parts, the sector is highly dependent on foreign capital. That means that you have a high level of visibility, and that increases the potential legitimacy problems for government officials if you have low levels of unionization. So it's a sector that has often historically had high levels of unionization. And it's also the case that in Mexico, you have a heritage of state corporatism where the former ruling party, the PRI, which was in control of the Mexican regime for 71 years continuously, created a system of so-called official unions with the Confederation of Mexican Workers, the largest corporatist confederation sort of dominating the industrial relations system. And although in the decade of the 1980s and then the 1990s, there was some question about whether or not the corporatist system would survive, government officials and party leaders during this period found that it was convenient to sort of maintain the corporatist system, provided that official unions, particularly those affiliated with the Confederation of Mexican Workers, acceded to the macroeconomic policies and terms associated with neoliberal reform, including limiting wage growth and safeguarding the investment climate. So often, what firms have found in the Mexican context is that there is strategic signaling from both federal officials and then officials in state governments about the importance of working with the Confederation of Mexican Workers and how the CTM can actually be beneficial in helping firms once they invest and start producing. And so rather than engaging in union avoidance, a dominant pattern which is developed in the automotive parts sector is one of preemptive unionization with the Confederation of Mexican Workers. And again, the logic of this is that the Confederation of Mexican Workers and its affiliates at the state level have offered firms wage moderation. That is, they pledge to limit the growth of wages regardless of increases in labor productivity, and they ensure that firms have weak plant level contracts with weak work rules that enhance flexibility, which is important for firms given the diffusion of lean production both in the finished vehicle industry and in different segments of the automotive parts sector. The Confederation of Mexican Workers has also limited workers' interest representation, and so it's a form of autocratic governance. And so, to summarize then, the CTM gains memberships and contracts, firms gain a pro-management partner, and the state is able to rebut claims that it is not allowing unionization in important parts of the industry. Beyond their preferences and interests related to unionization, firms are also interested in workers' educational levels. And so, although production in the automotive parts sector is often labor intensive, it's also the case that the work is semi-skilled, and firms often use levels of education as a proxy for workers' skill levels. And recent research has suggested that firms are basically looking for workers who might have 7 to 9 years or more of formal education, a little more if they are going to be supervisors of production. Normally, we might think of educational levels leading to higher levels of skill and perhaps higher wages. But in the Mexican context, the effects of education in the workforce are often attenuated by the type of unionization embedded in the workplace. And so because the CTM has been so concentrated in the sector, it limits wage growth and allows firms arguably to capture the benefits of workers' skill levels on productivity without an upward pressure on wages. Although some might think that more productive workers who are not being rewarded could simply exit a company and try to get a job at a competing firm, the fact that the CTM is so well organized and entrenched in the sector means that workers who are dissatisfied with this arrangement due to their productivity and their skill have few alternative places of employment in the sector where they can try to leverage their education and skill to get higher contract wages. Of course, labor conditions are not the only factors we argue that shape investment in the sector. So there's a large literature that looks at the role of women workers in production. It's also important to recognize the importance potentially of transportation infrastructure in investment decisions, whether or not state governments are offering investment incentives, the security environment, and the tendency sometimes of Mexican automotive parts plants to locate in proximity in the same state or region as finished vehicle plants. And so those other factors are important to control for in any study on foreign direct investment. So in the paper, we use what's called a cross-sectional time series data set. This might also be thought of as panel data. We have more states or units than years, and so this could be described reasonably as a cross-sectionally dominant data set or panel data set. Our dependent variable for the study is foreign direct investment across all of the different parts subsectors in Mexico, in each Mexican state and Mexico City from the period of 2004 to 2018. And the paper, which is attached on the Gerpisa website, describes the methodology in more detail. And so I won't go into a lot of the specifics here. Our main covariates or independent variables are related to labor conditions. And so one of our covariates comes from an original data set on union affiliation. And we have the percent of automotive unions in each state and year in Mexico by affiliation. And we use a 2-year lag structure to mitigate the possible endogeneity between unionization and foreign direct investment. And I talk a little more about that later on in this presentation. We also look at the overall unionization rate in each Mexican state and Mexico City, lagged. That's a unionization rate across all industries. And we look at the average or mean level of schooling in years of completed schooling in each year and state as a proxy measure of human capital or education in each state. And then the model controls for a number of other common influences on foreign direct investment. And again, the paper discusses these in more detail. And the statistical estimation that we used, again, is discussed in the paper, but it's pooled ordinary least squares with panel correction and Driscoll standard errors, which both control for panel heteroscedasticity and a lag-dependent variable for serial correlation. And again, there are more details about the different types of estimation techniques that we looked at but decided not to use, as well as the results of a GMM model to address the potential endogeneity between foreign direct investment and unionization. So what are the results of our analysis and the main takeaways? First, we found that states that had a higher level of unionization received more foreign direct investment. So the coefficient for unionization was positive and highly significant. It was also a substantively important relationship, we would argue. So a 1% increase on average in the state unionization rate was associated with an increase in over 3,000% in the log of foreign direct investment in the automotive parts sector. So that implies that firms were not engaged in union avoidance in any meaningful way, quite the opposite. The second major takeaway is that once we controlled for the type of unionization, it's clear that the Confederation of Mexican Workers and union affiliates in the automotive industry had a positive and highly significant effect in inducing foreign direct investment. And so what this means is that in states where the CTM was already well organized and entrenched in the auto industry, there was a higher inflow on average of foreign direct investment. And that relationship, again, is not due to sort of reverse causality or endogeneity. There are different types of endogeneity. Reverse causality is one. I won't go into the details here, but when we looked at this two-step GMM model and some other sort of qualitative indicators, we are reasonably confident that this relationship is not due to endogeneity. Beyond that, we also found important effects for schooling. So higher levels of completed schooling had a positive and significant effect. A 1-year increase in average schooling in each Mexican state was associated with a 34% increase in the log of foreign direct investment. We also found important effects for transportation infrastructure associated with rail lines. And surprisingly, real wages did not have an effect on foreign direct investment. But one way of thinking about this is that once you control and model unionization, there was no additional effect of wages on foreign direct investment. And because the Confederation of Mexican Workers is, engaged in sort of limiting wage growth, it makes sense that once you control for the CTM in the model, there's no additional effect of wages. So to summarize again, foreign direct investment flowed to Mexican states with a higher unionization rate, but where the Confederation of Mexican Workers was already well organized. States that had independent and democratic unions in the sector in prior periods saw less foreign direct investment on average. And given the Confederation of Mexican Workers' problematical history with union democracy, this suggests that firms clearly had a preference for autocratic union organization. And education and transportation infrastructure were also important inducements at the subnational level to foreign direct investment. More broadly, how do our findings relate to the USMCA agreement? We would argue that the findings of our study provide further broad evidence that the concerns around labor rights during the USMCA talks, specifically with regard to the auto industry, were valid. A related question has to do with whether or not the so-called legitimation process for collective bargaining agreements currently underway in Mexico will alter the landscape of union governance, and if so, what that means for future levels of foreign direct investment. As we discussed previously, at the present time, the government is supervising a process in which unions are required to submit their collective bargaining agreements to a vote by workers to see whether or not workers actually have approved in a free and fair election their collective bargaining agreement. Given the number of automotive parts plants and unions, digging through the administrative records and sort of triangulating the data to track the outcomes of legitimation is a complex process. We're currently working on that, but our results are not clear yet. However, there are potential lessons that we could learn from the process of legitimation in the finished vehicle sector thus far. Between September 2019 and May of 2022, only 43% of plants and unions in the finished vehicle sector have submitted their collective bargaining agreements to a vote of workers. And although there are independent and democratic unions in the finished vehicle sector, as well as the automotive parts sector, thus far in the finished vehicle sector, union votes on contracts has occurred in plants only organized by the Confederation of Mexican Workers. Of the 13 cases where there have been elections on contracts, the CTM lost in only one case. And what that means essentially is that the CTM has had a 92% success rate thus far in the finished vehicle sector. Although there have been some highly visible victories involving the rapid response mechanism under the USMCA for elections around collective bargaining agreements, like in GM Silao, in Tridenex, and in the parts plants in Nissan Aguascalientes, we should be cautious, therefore, about whether or not the impact of legitimation will ultimately transform the landscape of union governance. And what that means, we would argue, is that it's still unclear how the USMCA wage rules and the legitimation process will impact foreign direct investment in the medium and long term in Mexico. And so we think that this is an important area for future research, and we hope that future scholars and researchers will continue to address this important topic. Thank you very much.